In the early hours of July 28, 1976, the city of Tangshan, China went to sleep believing it was an ordinary summer night. There were no warnings, no foreshock strong enough to cause alarm, and no expectation that the next few seconds would reshape an entire nation. At exactly 3:42 a.m., a violent jolt tore through the North China Plain, unleashing one of the most powerful inland earthquakes of the 20th century. The quake measured 7.5 on the Richter scale, though some estimates place it even higher. What made it catastrophic wasn't just the magnitude, but the location. Tangshan was a tightly packed mining city built on soft, unstable soil. Many of its buildings were older brick-and-mortar structures with little resistance to lateral shaking. In an instant, entire neighborhoods folded like cards. Survivors described the ground rising and falling like ocean waves. Streets split wide open, water and gas lines burst under pressure, and multi-story factories collapsed straight down, trapping entire night shift crews inside. In residential districts, home after home crumbled, leaving families buried under tons of rubble before they could fully wake. Rescue would be complicated by another factor. Communication lines snapped instantly. Telegraphs, phone lines, and rail links were severed. For several crucial hours, the outside world had no idea Tangshan had been leveled. The destruction was staggering. Nearly 80% of Tangshan's buildings were destroyed, including steel mills, coal mines, hospitals, and schools. Trains toppled off their tracks, roads were rendered unusable, and bridges lay cracked or collapsed. When dawn came, the landscape didn't look like a city anymore. Survivors later said Tangshan was quiet, so utterly still that it felt like time had stopped. But beneath that silence were tens of thousands of people calling faintly from the rubble. The Chinese government declared an all-out emergency, though that message wasn't delivered immediately. In 1976, China was still under the political tension of the final days of Mao Zedong's rule. Information flow was tightly controlled, especially regarding disasters. Within hours, military units and emergency teams were mobilized, but even then, the government initially attempted to control the narrative tightly. For the first day, the world outside China heard almost nothing. Even other Chinese provinces received minimal detail. The lack of early reporting wasn't malicious so much as systemic. China in the 1970s operated under strict secrecy, and acknowledging such a devastating disaster could be seen as a sign of weakness. So, officials tried to assess and manage the crisis internally before making public announcements. This is why the Tangshan earthquake is often referred to as the disaster China tried to hide. Not because the government denied it occurred, but because the full scope of the devastation wasn't shared until much later. Meanwhile, on the ground, the reality was grim. Rescue crews faced unbearable conditions. Aftershocks struck repeatedly, some as high as magnitude 6.2. Buildings that had partially survived the initial quake collapsed during these secondary shocks, killing both trapped survivors and rescuers. Temperatures soared in the summer heat. Clean water was scarce, and the smell of dust, smoke, and ruptured sewage filled the air. With hospitals destroyed, medical teams operated out of makeshift tents, using whatever tools they could find. In some districts, survival came down to neighbors rescuing neighbors. People dug through collapsed homes with bare hands, and thousands of lives were saved this way. Ordinary citizens clawing through debris, listening for faint tapping or muffled voices, refusing to give up even as the hours turned into days. Officially, China later reported 242,000 deaths. Unofficial estimates, however, run much higher, some suggesting 300,000 to 700,000 victims, which would make the Tangshan earthquake the deadliest of the 20th century. Discrepancies exist because of limited record keeping, population density, and the fact that entire families perished with no one left to report them missing. Beyond the human toll, the earthquake also had immense political and economic consequences. It struck during a period of major political uncertainty. Premier Zhou Enlai had died earlier that year, and Mao Zedong himself would die just months later. The government was already strained by the Cultural Revolution's final years. Tangshan, a vital coal mining hub, produced resources essential for the national energy supply, and its destruction disrupted coal production across northern China. Reconstruction began almost immediately, but it was a colossal undertaking. Millions of tons of rubble needed to be cleared, housing had to be rebuilt from scratch, and infrastructure required near total replacement. Entire neighborhoods were redesigned with earthquake-resistant engineering in mind, and over the next decade, Tangshan transformed into a symbol of national resilience. By the late 1980s, the city had become one of China's largest urban renewal success stories. Yet the emotional scars remained. For survivors, the memories of that night were impossible to forget. The sudden violence, the darkness, the cries for help, and the long wait for rescue. Many families lost multiple generations, grandparents, parents, and children within seconds. What makes the Tangshan earthquake particularly haunting is not just the scale of destruction, but how abruptly it happened. There was no warning system in 1976, no early detection, no automated alerts. Entire neighborhoods simply ceased to exist between one breath and the next. In the end, the Tangshan disaster reshaped China's approach to natural catastrophes. It led to massive reforms in seismic research, emergency planning, and construction standards. It also pushed China toward more transparency in later decades, especially after international criticism over the slow release of information. Today, Tangshan is a completely rebuilt modern city, but if you walk through its parks and memorials, you'll find reminders of the night when the ground rose up and swallowed an entire metropolis. The disaster stands as one of the most devastating and least understood tragedies of the 20th century, an event many outside China still know almost nothing about, and that makes its story worth telling. Thank you everybody for watching the video. If you enjoyed this content, please consider subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate the support.